Okay, kids, so I've been asked to make a little hint video for Chapter 8 assignment, question 17. So in this question, you have to imagine that there is a tube, and the tube's length never changes. That's very important to remember that the tube's length never changes. And we're going to say that this air column right here, okay, there it is. So the air column stretches from here to here. There's the air column. I'm drawing for you again in yellow. Okay, I'm going to say it has a length L, and that never changes. And we're told that it experiences resonance, or its fundamental frequency, at 330 hertz. But you have to remember that this is the fundamental frequency. So this is the frequency that will give the shortest, simplest pattern, which is this one right here. Okay? Which is this one right there. See it? Right there. That's what it looks like. Okay? And we know that that pattern involves a length of half of a wavelength. You get a quarter from it here and a quarter from it there. The fundamental frequency for open at both ends means that the length of the tube matches up to half a wavelength. That's what the fundamental frequency means. That this frequency matches up to a tube length being half of the wavelength. So that means half of the wavelength is equal to L, because I said L was the length of the tube. So I do a little rearranging here, and I get that the fundamental wavelength, lambda naught, the fundamental wavelength, lambda naught, is equal to 2L. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is that this wave, this sound wave, has this speed, V naught. Next, we want to find out what is, or what are the next two harmonics. The next two harmonics. Well, the next harmonic would be set up when this pattern is established, still in that tube of length L. This is the next pattern that is set up. And this next pattern, you add a wavelength. Okay, you add a wavelength to the pattern, all right? So we want this pattern right here, where you get half a wavelength here and a quarter on each side, so that this length L is actually a wavelength of the frequency, which is the first harmonic. Okay, the next harmonic, not the fundamental harmonic, but the next one, which we would say has a frequency F1. And the sound wave that's producing this, we're going to say moves with the speed V1. So imagine it being like this. You get this pattern set up with a uh, tuning fork that is making a sound at 330 hertz. We want to find the frequency of a tuning fork that makes this pattern in here. So where do we start to try to figure this out? Well, we need to realize that since the tube is existing in the same air, regardless of what frequencies we're using, the speed of the wave V0 and the speed of the wave V1 is being produced by two different tuning forks, if you will, two different sources of sound, but it's in the same air at the same temperature, so these speeds will be the same. So this is where we start. V0 is equal to V1. The two speeds are the same. Then we use the universal wave equation, that this frequency, F0, times this wavelength, Y0, right, has to equal this frequency, what we're trying to figure out, times this wavelength. We're using the universal wave equation. But we know what the length of each of these wavelengths are in terms of the length of this tube, which never changes. We know that lambda naught is 2L, so I put it in there. We know that lambda 1 is L, So I put it in there, and then look what happens. Look what happens right here. The L cancels out. So we know that the frequency here set up this pattern, right? The next harmonic, and that's what we're looking for, the next harmonic. That frequency is twice the original frequency. So the next thing they want you to do is, if you this up to the next harmonic, right, which would be frequency 3, right? It would be frequency 3. The tube length is still L, right? But now we're operating with a different wavelength. So you've got to remember, what's the pattern that sets up in here that would be the next one? And then find out what that frequency is, F3, in terms of the original frequency, F0. Okay? Oh, did I call it F3? Why did I do that? Let's fix that. That's F2, my mistake. I'm skipping the number 2. Why would I do that? F2, the next harmonic. Okay, and lambda 2, the next harmonic. You've got to know what this pattern is, just like I knew that the next pattern was this one. And then you do all the mathematics to find out, hey, what is that second frequency here? Oopsie. What is that second frequency here in terms of F0? And remember, whatever speed the wave has in here, we'll call it V2, hasn't changed from the speed we had before. All right, so part B is all about a tube like before, but it's closed at one end. And we know now that the fundamental frequency of 330 hertz, okay, produces the first or fundamental pattern for closed ends, which looks like this. We know the length of the tube is L. We know the speed of the wave is V naught. We've just taken out the tube that we were using in part B and replaced it with this tube, which is closed at one end. And we know that the fundamental frequency matches the fundamental wavelength, which will give us this pattern, the first pattern. It's the simplest pattern. And we know that that simplest pattern corresponds to a quarter of the wavelength that corresponds to F naught, which would be lambda naught. And that lambda naught over 4 is the length of this tube. So we rearrange this and we get lambda naught is equal to 4L. Next, we want to know the next harmonic, right? So the length of the tube hasn't changed. It's still L, but we're using a different frequency now. We're using a different frequency because we want to set up the next pattern. And the next pattern for closed end looks like this, which would be half a wavelength, right? Half a wavelength from here to here, and then another quarter wavelength to get to there. So that's 3/4 of a wavelength, but not the original wavelength, this new wavelength, lambda 1, which is associated with a new frequency, let's say a different tuning fork that's being used. And that tuning fork operates at F1, but I don't know what that frequency is, but I'm going to figure it out. So I know that the first pattern is set up like this, so we have 3 lambda 1 over 4 is equal to L. I rearrange this and I get lambda 1 is equal to 4 over 3 times L, the length of the tube. We're going to use the same idea as we did last time. The fact that it doesn't matter which tuning fork you're using. If you're using the tuning fork that's operating at this frequency, F0, or if you're using the tuning fork that's operating at this yet unknown frequency, F1, okay, the speeds of the wave is the same because we're going to assume that they're operating in air at the same temperature. Then I make this change using the universal wave equation. V is equal to frequency times wavelength, right? And for the first one, it would be F naught lambda naught. Second one would be F1 lambda 1. Now, we know what F naught is. That's 330 hertz. But we also know what lambda naught is in terms of the tube which has a length L, right? We know through this arrangement here that lambda naught is 4 times L. And we know by understanding what the second pattern is, right, that L would have to be 3/4 of that wavelength, or lambda 1 is 4 over 3L. So I plug that in for each one. Okay, I plug that in for each one. Then look what happens here. The 4's cancel. Okay, the L's cancel, right? And it leaves me with 3 times the first, or fundamental frequency, is equal to F1. So it's 3 times as much. Now they want you to calculate the next one as well. So remember, we have the same tube. It's still of length L. But now we want to find out what frequency F2 will give me the next pattern in here. And that wave will be moving at a speed v2, which is still equal to v1 and v0. Speed of sound depends on the temperature. Even though you're using a different tuning fork, it doesn't matter. So you've got to know, well, what would be the next pattern in here? I know the tube length is still L. What is the next pattern in here? The next harmonic. And then you would use similar mathematics to figure this out. I hope this helps. Have a great day.